Welcome back to the White Boat Studio in Sozopol in Bulgaria. My name is Martin Stephenson, and this is a short tutorial about, well, it won't be short, it'll be an hour long or so, and it's a scene from the docks in Burgas, which is the nearest big city. This is one that I did earlier of a tug, but today we're going to do one of the lighthouse. All these techniques that you'll see today are included in my ebook, and if you'd like a copy of my ebook, just send me an email to artstevo@gmail.com, and you can find everything that I do on my blog, which is www.artstevo.wordpress.com. So today we're going to be doing this with quite a stormy sky. I want the emphasis to be on the whiteness of this lighthouse, which, as you'll see from the photograph, is quite smart and white, but I want to make it look a bit rusty. So that's the plan. I've used a bit of artistic license. If you look at the photograph that's in the comments section, or I may include it on here, you'll see that I've moved some things around. I wanted to do this portrait rather than a landscape format, which is how the photograph was originally taken, just because I want to put emphasis on the height of this lighthouse. This is going to be the main focal point, so I'll want the focal point to be just here, which is going to have the darkest area of sky just there against the whiteness of this lighthouse just here. So I want the focal point to be here, just off centre, and I've used the rule of kind of thirds for this composition. Yeah, let's give it a whirl. I've got my Tintoretto paints, tube paint, squeezed into a palette. You can see it's not a clean palette. I've got a water sprayer and a couple of jugs of water, and I have this standing by, which is basically this one is burnt sienna, then we've got burnt umber and ultramarine, and these two colours mixed together give you some of the nicest greys, so we're going to be using those for shadows. In addition to that, we'll use one of my favourite colours, which is Caput Mortum, and I think this paint colour is only available from Tintoretto, but I think it's close to neutral tint, but you can mix your own with the vermilion and ultramarine, and it's a lovely granulating colour. I've got toilet roll and a cloth standing by. I've got a dish for my brushes with a piece of moist sponge in the bottom, and I'm going to be using a selection of brushes today, which will be a Ron Ransom Hake brush, and if you've never used one of these, I suggest that you do. They're brilliant, but I've used lots of different hakes. In fact, somebody emailed me only today to say he'd bought a hake and all the hairs were coming out, and that was my experience of every other brand of hake apart from this one, which is by Pro Art, and I think it's made in Yorkshire. I'm going to be using a combination of flat brushes, round brushes, needlepoint brushes from Alvaro Castañer, very nice, and sword liners, which actually I'll show you how to use those later. So these are a selection of brushes. So I'm going to make a start by spraying on the paint colours that I want to use. So the sky colour is going to be a combination of this one, which is, can you see this? Yeah, that's cobalt blue, so we'll give that a squirt. And there's some cerulean blue in there, mixed about that purple. We may want a little bit of light red to add to it, because I want the stormy sky. These two colours are the same two colours that were in my butcher's tray, and this is ultramarine and this is burnt umber. I'm working on a slight slope, so there might be some residual damage here, and this is the way that I usually paint, which is on about 10 or 15 degree angle, and it gives you some lovely movement in the sky. So I'm going to do this paint the sky wet into wet, which involves wetting the sky first with water. Just spray my tins over here, my Caput Mortum. And I want to try and control this and try to keep this area here very white. So I'm going to paint this very accurately with a, sorry about my head there, I was just seeing if I was dripping all over my drawing board. So I'm left-handed, So I'll be starting my sky I'll probably go this way. I may tip my board as well so that the emphasis on any rain is coming towards this area of the light and dark just here. I've moved some of the things around as well, and you really shouldn't be afraid to do that. These buildings let me just see if I can get a close-up of it. These buildings just here, these silos for grain, are actually over this side of the lighthouse, but I moved them because I wanted to do a portrait. I've also squashed all this up together. So don't be afraid to move things around just to suit your own taste. I'm going to paint with the water first, but first I'm going to mix my paints just to make sure they're all ready to go. The last thing you need when you're working against the clock is to have to mix more paint of the same colour. So it's always prudent to make sure you've got quite a lot mixed up. So I'm going to mix some of this cobalt blue in with this. I also use a test strip, and this is my test strip. Just make sure what colour we've got. Watercolours dry lighter, so you can afford to be quite strong with that. I'll just leave that up there. And I'm going to mix some of my caput mortem into this dish till it's smooth with it's a granulating paint, is this, so there will be some granulations in there, but it's a lovely shadow colour. I'll mix some of these two together. You might hear the noise when I've got a sponge in the bottom of this water pot, so make sure my brush is really clean, otherwise it gets contaminated. So you can see that is gives you lovely combinations of shadow colours and greys. So I'm trying to depict a kind of grey day in Burgas, which it rarely is. It's usually a really sunny city. So I'm going to mix this tin up as well. The same two colours that I've just got there. I'm just softening these. You can reuse the paints. Being a tight Yorkshireman, it suits me because it means that you don't have any waste. Mix some of that in as well. So we've got some lovely greys there now, which I may use in the sky. So you can see we've got kind of dirty grey colour there. I've got a couple of jugs of water. So I use one for mixing my paints and a clean one standing by to do the wetting to wet, because I don't really want to contaminate this. I think I've just splashed a little bit of paint on my painting, but it's not the end of the world. I'm going to use this 1.5 inch or an inch, is it about 1.25 inch flat brush, because I want to cut very accurately around this lighthouse. So I'm going to start just by spraying, but I'm going to keep the spray away from this side of the painting, and this is just really for speed. Obviously I'm working against the clock. We've got, if anybody's read my book, you'll know about the golden time, which is the amount of time it takes for the paint to dry, which in these circumstances it's March here, but it's still quite warm. Temperatures have gone up to about 15 degrees. There's no air conditioning on in the studio today, and I'm just making sure that I've got this covered. You'll find that the areas where you start to dry almost immediately. This paper's been sat here waiting for me to start, so it's actually got quite warm. So you just need a thin film of water. I don't know if you can see that. I actually work against the light so I can see how shiny everything is and if I've missed anywhere. So let's carry on with that. If it's anywhere dark, you can go over it with water and subsequently the paint. But if it's light, you need to cut around it as accurately as you can. We'll see how accurately I am when I start to put the paint on. So these areas of the docks, they're going to be quite dark. So I'll go right down over those. The effect that I'm trying to get here is there are really busy docks in Burgas. So I want to give the impression of lots of activity, smoke coming from stacks on these boats, activity in the boatyard, which is causing mist. So I'm looking for a kind of misty effect down in this area of the painting. Now you can see that my paper's buckled up a little bit. This is 300 gram Bockingford paper, which I've just taped down with masking tape. I'm not a believer in stretching paper, and you can manage this amount of buckling quite well. What you've got to be careful is you don't end up with stripes where the paint collects in the hollows. You can see I'm in no hurry to start this. You can soak this paper as much as you want until it'll actually get to a point where it stops getting saturated. So I'm keeping an eye on the areas that I started. I can see there's a dry area just here. It's better to have too much water. So now let's go for it with a big round brush. So I'm going to go for some of this grey colour, which has this ultramarine, and I'm just kind of tickling the paper. I'm going to introduce a little bit of blue in there as well. It's always good if you can have a continuous border around your side of your painting. This area of sky here, I'm going to make this quite light, because that's going to contrast against the dark of that lighthouse. So I'm working very quickly now, going for got a big brush. Might have been better if I'd have used a hake here. Very accurately around here. Any gaps that you leave will look like rain, so as I'm approaching here, I'm being conscious that this wants to be really dark in there, so I'm going into a really thick ultramarine and burnt umber mix down here, being careful not to hit the side of the lighthouse like I've just done. It's starting to dry already, so I'm conscious of that. I'm going to cut around some of these buildings because I want some highlights on here. We'll keep that area light. And now I'm going to tip the board, and this will give you direction on these. I'm going to try and get an effect of rain. The important thing when you do this is to hold it on one angle and just keep it at that one angle. You can see I'm starting to get some effects of rain just there. So now with a damp piece of chamois, I'm going to squeeze out. So it's just a piece of chamois leather. You can use tissue, or you can use, I may use both actually, but this has to be quite dry. If there's a shine on your paper, you can still continue to work, and it is still shiny down here. So I'm just going to lift off some of this to give the effect of busyness around these buildings. Try a little bit of tissue as well. And if you've got any little bits on it, which I have, using a brush that's almost squeezed dry, just going to carefully lift these off. If your brush is too wet, you'll end up with a cauliflower. Just a couple of little hairs, and that's it. Now it's tempting to actually mess with it and fiddle with it, and it's the worst thing that you can do, to be honest. So what you've got to do now is be patient, let it dry, or you can use a hairdryer, which I'm going to do. So I'll just switch the camera off and I'll come back once it's dry. Okay, the painting's dry now. You can see, one thing I forgot to mention is the direction of light. I did say that this side of the windmill was going to be a highlight, so I always put an arrow in the top border of my painting. It just helps to remind you as you work your way through the painting to make sure the shadows are consistent and the highlights are consistent. I've decided to do this as a kind of monochrome painting because I quite like the colour of the sky. It's all granulated, lovely, a little bit of blue up there. But now it means that we can do a little bit of lifting off. Now the success of lifting off really depends a lot on the colours that you use. You can see from the side of the windmill just here, sorry, not windmill, lighthouse, that I was a bit clumsy there with my water and subsequent paint that went on. So I'm gonna get that line back, and I'm also going to lift out a couple of highlights on these silos in the background there, and also we may do some lifting off here where these railings are against this dark sky, and I may do a little bit of lifting off down here because these cranes are yellow. So I painted over most of the things there, but I quite like how this one's ended up just here. This building's going to be dark here. There's going to be very little colour in this painting at all. The lighthouse here is red for the port side and green for the starboard side. So the top of this one is all green and the top of this one is all red. There's a big tanker there that's being unloaded, and there's some burgundy on the bottom of there. Now when you paint in water, if you paint in a lake or a still body of water, your reflections are almost identical to what appears above. But when you paint in the sea, you get very few reflections. But that doesn't mean that I don't like them. So I'm going to give myself some nice white reflections from this building here, maybe some here, from these silos and here, and I'm going to drag these into the water. I'm going to use similar colours to the sky as I did, sorry, for the sea I'm going to use similar colours, they would just be reflected from the sky. Excuse the girlies from next door playing outside. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to move this out of the way, and I'm going to turn my board because it's easier for me to lift this area out with that away from me like that. So I'm standing by with some kitchen roll or tissue. It's better if you can get plain tissue, but anyway, we'll have to live with this. So the technique here is to wet your brush in the water and then squeeze most of the water out of it, but it still has to have some moisture in it, otherwise it won't lift off, and you'll tell immediately when I touch this painting whether or not this is going to work or I need to re-wet my brush. So all I'm doing, I'll zoom in on this so you can see exactly what's happening. Excuse the camera shake. That should be it. So I'm just with the flat brush, and I've squeezed it and I've just put it on the flat of my hand, which is the flattest part, and you'll see how sharp that brush is now. So it does mean that I can lift out very accurately. So the secret is to just move the brush from side to side until the pigment starts to lift, and then just mop it dry with a tissue. Same again, once it's lifted out some pigment, it's in the brush, so you've got to make sure your brush is clean. So same again on the heel of my hand, and I'll just lift out this area here. Lifting out is one of my very favourite techniques. Sometimes it's not the paint that you add to the paper that gives it beauty, it's what you do to when you lift paint off as well. I'm also going to let me just pause it while these girls have gone. Okay, I've shut the window now. Okay, so I want some whites here, and this is a good sized brush for doing these railings. So again, I've washed my brush, squeezed it on the flat of my hand, so it's very accurate. And the more vertical you have your brush, the more accurate this line will be, and the finer the line. So I'm just lifting out and then dabbing. You can see now that we've got the start of those railings against the dark sky, and it's much easier than using things like masking fluid. So I'm going to lift out the top handrail and also some more of these. So you've just got to be very slow, nothing happens, and then suddenly it does. The ability to lift off like this really depends on the colour, and you can see the effect of just doing that now. And I'll do the same on the other side, although this side is very light. So I'm not expecting this to show up very much, because I wanted to keep the light sky on that side. So using Ron Ranson's counter change rule, which means that you position the darkest things in the painting against the lightest things. This is the lightest part of my sky on this side of the, and this is going to be the darkest part of this lighthouse. So I'm using counter change on here. I'm also using counter change on here because the darkest part of my sky is just here, and this is going to be the whitest part of the painting down this leading edge of the lighthouse. So I'll just get a little bit of this out here, if you can see that. Get that edge back. I have another banister here. Yeah, it doesn't show up that much. But now, as you can see, I've now got a very accurate line down both sides of my lighthouse, and we've done some lifting off there. So now I'm going to carry on. So I'll zoom back out for you. I'll actually leave it like that. So let's have, there's also another little technique that you can use. Here where I lifted out some smoke, if you just use a damp cotton wool bud, you can actually lift out some smoke quite accurately. So you just use a kind of circular motion and then dab it with tissue, and this gives you a more subtle effect than if you were using a moist brush or a tissue when it was wet. So you can see now that we've got some patches of kind of misty, smoky, busy things happening around those docks. The next thing I'm going to do, I'll zoom out for this one, is I'm going to do the water now. So I'm going to mix up just the same colours that I did do for the sky. So I'm going to this time use this, which is, if you remember, ultramarine and burnt umber, and there's a little bit of that colour in there as well, which is burnt sienna, and I want to use that on this boat. So when you paint in water, the most important thing to do is to make sure that your brush strokes are perfectly horizontal. Now when I'm doing the big areas of a painting, say the sky and the water, I usually stand up, because you can use big exaggerated sweeps with the brush, and it's very difficult. What usually happens is, if you sit your hand down on the paper, you tend to get a curved brush stroke, whereas if you use an arm movement, you can actually be very accurate with it. And it's important that water's always flat, so it's important to make sure that you use either vertical strokes or perfectly horizontal strokes. I'll use vertical strokes for the reflections of the whites that I want to. So I'm going to put a whole wash on this, which I'll probably do wet into wet, and then I'm going to lift out highlights from these boats and maybe some of these buildings as well, and they will give us a visual link from the background to the foreground. We've got one already because the lighthouse kind of links the two, but these reflections coming into here will hopefully mean that your eye will go to this area of the painting, and then it'll explore around here. And if you run along here, there's a couple of little tricks that I use in paintings, and they just happen to be in this photo anyway. But if you place a vertical item, whether it's a tree or a lamppost or something, in this case it's the floodlights and the pylons in the dockyard, and this one over this side is a crane, it actually gives a barrier, so that when your viewer views, you want it to go here, investigate this, but his eye will stop on this vertical line here, or this vertical line over here with the crane. So it's just a little trick that I use to try and make sure that your viewer is engaged in the area of painting that you want him to do. I've just noticed a little bit here that needs fixing, so I'll do the same wiping off. This is a staining colour, so it might take some work, but that's fine. The other thing that I would also recommend that you do is, when you're drying your paper with a hairdryer, which I've just done, keep checking your masking tape all the way around, because if you don't, it'll mean that as it dries and shrinks back, you can actually, it cockles the paper as it stretches back down, and it'll lift your tape off. So this board is actually, the rough side of melamine is on this side, and that's the side that I use to tape. If I was to use the other side, which is shiny, the masking tape wouldn't stick as well, so I always use the dull side of the board. Another little tip there for you. So now I'm going to do the water. Now this brush is actually a little bit too big for some of these. It'll be okay for that one, might be alright for that one, and I might turn it this way, or I'll use another flat brush, a smaller flat brush for the reflection. So I've got 2 or 3 here, and all I'll use is just the appropriate size for whatever reflection I want. So let's go for that. So I've got some paint mixed up in here, so I'll make sure I've got enough before I start. Using clean water. I like it when ultramarine and burnt umber mix, because they give you lovely colours that granulate as well. So just wash my brush out right to the bottom of the pot, as you can probably hear. And now I'm still stood up, and I'm just going to leave a little gap of white just there, and I'm just dragging this water down here, and on this one just below that line up to those boats. And these are exactly the same brush strokes that I'm going to use when I put the paint on. So I'm painting this wet into wet. I'm not too fussed about the rocks here, because they're generally going to be darker, and I'm happy to leave some gaps of white which look like, I think sailors call them wind holes. So I'll just give you some highlights. As I say, you generally don't get reflections from seawater, but we'll have some today. You can also use a flat brush stroke this way, and you can hear when your brush needs dipping in the water again, because you get the sound of dry brush. If you listen properly, you can probably hear it happening. There, did you hear it? That's the sound of, but I'm quite happy for some dry brush strokes in that foreground. It's a great way of getting texture on water. So I'm looking against the light, and I can see that this, I don't know if you can see, yeah, you can see that the sheen's starting to go off the top here, and if I start to paint now I may end up with either a cauliflower or a hard edge, which I don't want. So I'm just going to do exactly the same, a bit more water this time, again being accurate up against this lighthouse. I've already got my paint mixed up. Now I'm going to go for it real fast. Same brush strokes. This is a little bit wet over this side, being very accurate against that lighthouse. I'm happy to let that bleed. Horizontal line here up to these boats, just repeating this brush stroke. It's important that this area stays wet, because I want to do that lifting off. So now I'm going to mix a bit more blue into the mix. What we're doing is trying to reflect those sky colours. A bit more brown. I'll turn my brush and use big horizontal brush strokes. And if this goes, I'm trying to get this to go a bit lighter as we get into the foreground, up to those rocks. And now very quickly what we need to do is to lift out these reflections. So I'm going to take these flat brushes. Where are you? Where are you? No, they're over there. Dip this in the water, take the surplus off. I'll start by doing the big one first, I think. I'll wet the brush, but not too much water on it, because we're actually soaking up water. So that would have a big reflection coming down here. Big sweep with the brush. That one's about the same size, so that one will do. Just make sure that these brush strokes are perfectly vertical. and this one may have a highlight on it. What happens is that these highlights actually bleed back in, so you may have to do this 2 or 3 times. And if you notice an area where it starts to look as if it's drying, because obviously the more we're lifting off, the more that paint's drying, then you need to stop. But if you want to indicate some movement on the water, just take a brush, squeeze all the moisture out of it, make sure there's none on the ferrule, and then just with a big horizontal sweep, just break some of those vertical lines up, and it starts to look like movement on the water. And I'm happy with that. So we'll let that dry now, and then we'll come back to it. We still have a shine on this area of the painting just there, so I'm just going to take the opportunity to lift out another highlight about there. Maybe another one here. When you're painting nature or natural things, the biggest trick is trying to make everything appear random. So even when it comes to these reflections, I'm making sure that they're not all the same. So the golden rule is, if you've got a shine on your paper, you can still work on it. If you've no shine, then don't even try it, because it will just turn to mud. And beginners particularly are susceptible to that. There's a whole chapter in my book about avoiding mud. So this area still got a bit of a shine on it, but not much. And it's dry down here, so I've avoided going all the way down. And just a quick sweep will break that line up. So now, as you can see, we've got some nice reflections on the water. Okay, so I'll let that dry and then we'll come back to it. When I turn the camera on, and I haven't got a remote for this camera, so it's on a boom is the camera, so it tends to shift. It's also possible to lift off some highlights if you've missed any when the paint is dry. I've dried the water area now, so you'll find that if you do lifting off while the paint is wet in the water, then you get soft reflections. But if you wanted a harder reflection, wait until the paint's dry and then you can lift off some. So for instance, on this area here where we've got a I don't know if you can see this area here where we've got this pylon where the lights are, maybe that should be a whiter highlight. So I'm just going to do that now. Same procedure. Take the moisture out of the brush on the heel of my hand, squeeze it so it goes really straight, and then just almost vertically, using the brush vertically, and obviously vertical brush strokes, we've now got a reflection for that pylon. And you can do that, you can have great fun with it. I may do one over this side as well, because this is quite a dark area of the painting and there is something up here, so maybe I'll do another reflection over there. Exactly the same procedure. And we've now got these cranes. I'll carry on with some more lifting off with these crane areas exactly the same way, and then I'll let you see the results when I come back. You can see now from this area here, I've lifted off some more cranes here. Another one over here. Where are we? There. Excuse me. And I've also lifted off from this pylon just here and one or two here. And that gives you a lovely depth. You'll never really get back to white paper, but it'll actually give you some what looks like distant. You get more distant things. Now Ron Ranson, who some of you may have heard of, the late great Ron Ranson, advocated something called, what do they call it? Recession, I think it's called. And this is one of his books. You can see how dog-eared it is. I've had it a few years, and this really taught me to paint with a combination of hakes. I think Ron used to use a rigger, a hake and a flat brush, and that was the only brushes that you need, and I think 6 tubes of paint. So the late great Ron Ranson, I owe him a lot. Okay, so now I'm going to try and lift out. When you select areas to lift out the highlights, sometimes it may not be there in your drawing. You may end up with a dark area of the painting, as I did here. This was quite intentional, but these are standing out more. So it's counter change. So you're looking for dark things against light things. Recession that Ron speaks, I think there's 2 sections in his book about it, is basically how to get distance in your painting. So generally speaking, I start from the back and work forwards and making the colours stronger and also the colours warmer as I get to here. So one of the darkest things in the painting is going to be around this area here, and also these rocks in the foreground and the right hand side of this, which is away from the sunlight, so that's going to be in shadow. And painting in that way gives you a lot of depth in your work, so it makes it look more realistic. So the next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to add the distant city of Burgas in behind these docks. So I'm going to use my caput mortuum, and I'm just going to use this. Blues tend to, if you look at an area of, say, a hill with green trees on it, you'll notice it doesn't look green because of the distance it is away from your eye. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with caput mortuum, and I'm going to work on some of these background buildings in here. So I'll just pause the video while I do that, because you may see my head in the camera, and then I'll come back to it. I'm just going to use a variety of flat brushes to get the looks of flats, blocks of flats, buildings. This one's got a terracotta roof. This painting is all about, it's usually a good idea to either use a cool colour scheme with a very little bit of hot colour in it. So the hot colours here are going to be the yellows of the cranes, the reds of this roof, and the reds, and maybe some, I may put some dark blues on these boats and tugs. So it's that, and you've got to try and retain the whites in your painting as well. We have got some white gouache, and I use either thick gouache or a watered down version of it, and those will come right at the very end if you happen to have missed out on any highlights. I know the purists don't like it, but hey ho, I'm not a purist. So I'll do some work on these buildings, and I'm basically going to paint the shadow sides of some distant blocks of flats, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, welcome back. As you can see, I've done some work on this background. I've also painted the glass panes on there, and I've used a little bit of dry brush on that to get the effect of the shine on the glass. And I've also done, let me just see if I can show you, lots of blocks of flats around here, the background of the town behind all these docks. So I've done all that. I'm now going to attempt to, let me just zoom out. I'm going to attempt to do the very darkest area of this. I normally work from back to front, but I want to do this because this is still drying, so I just want to make sure that's dry before I start carrying on that area. Now for this I'm going to use, it's very important to get this absolutely vertical and dark. So this is what they call a marl stick, and it's basically a piece of plastic piping, which is great because I'm going to hold this on here. What I usually do is, this is to get straight lines, so I usually put my cloth up here, and then just sit my marl stick on top of the cloth, and then hold it where I want to do the vertical line. So in this particular case it's going to be about there, and I'm going to just run my brush up against this marl stick. So the best way of doing this is to make sure that I'm going to use a flat brush that's about the size that I need. So that would be, yep, something about like that. And I'm going to mix very dark caput mortuum. Don't forget, this is going to be one of the darkest things in the painting. And I'm going to practice on, I've got some black as well, because the black is right at the bottom of the lighthouse. But I'm going to practice on this piece at the side first, just to make sure that I've got the right amount of paint. When I've dipped my paint in the water first and then into the paint, but as you can probably see, there's beads of water on the ferrule of the brush. Now if I were to lift my brush up vertically to try and draw this line very accurately, there's a chance that those drops of water will drop into my paint and we won't end up with a straight line. So I'm just using a piece of tissue just to take those blobs of water off the ferrule, and I'm going to have a dummy run on this area here, if you can see that. So you just hold the brush, run it up the side and hold it. And sometimes it runs out of paint. I don't know if you can see that, but at the bottom we've ended up with some dry brush, which is quite nice. So but we've got a very accurate line, and that's what I need for all the verticals. So I'm going to use this technique with a mile stick for all the cranes, the this area of the what is that? Oh, it's the lights. All the cranes are going to be done. I'm going to do them with a combination of either a flat brush or probably something more akin to these. This one is particularly good. You could use a rigger for this work, but this one is an Alvaro Castaner brush, and it goes to a beautiful point. It's actually thinner than a rigger, but you've just got to make sure the belly of the brush holds massive amounts of fluid. So you've just got to make sure that you take off the surplus before you move to your painting, otherwise you get a big blob. These brushes are also very good as well. These are sword liner brushes, and again give you very fine lines. And I'm going to use a variety of these, just so that we don't get all the cranes exactly the same width. So I'm going to use a combination of darks, the caput mortem, and some yellows on these cranes, particularly ones that are closer to my eye here. But I don't want yellow down here, and these I might do just in caput mortem on the dark side of these cranes. So I'm just going to, I'll show you that line now down the, if I dare, because this can go horribly wrong. So I've had a dummy run on my, I know that the strength of paint is about right. So I'm going to load my brush up again, and I'm trying to load enough paint to get right from the top to the very bottom. So again, I'm just checking my brush to make sure there's no surplus on there. I'll just dab that to make sure that that's a nice shape for me. Now with my marl stick, I'm holding it up to the side of that, making sure that it's perfectly vertical, and in one sweep from top to bottom. Try not to press, you've got to keep the consistency of the brush consistent all the time, and then the line ends up being like that. And I'll just alter the angle of the top of this, and I'm happy with that. You can see I've got some dry brush at the bottom, which is very nice. And then while that's still wet, I'll just use the same brush with my black paint and just finish off the very bottom of it. And we'll just soften that with my fingers. And that's it, we've done the dark side of that. There's a very small piece of masonry work in between each of these sections. I think this is octagonal, the tower for this lighthouse. So I'm going to use another flat brush for this area here. It's a little bit too wide. No, I think it will do. Excuse me. So I've just wet my brush, and I'm going to use this big flat brush with a marl stick again, and I can do this because I can leave a very fine gap between there. If I wanted this, if this line was touching this line and it didn't have this light area right on the edge, then I would let that dry first, otherwise there'll be some bleeding. But now I'm going for a, so this was my tone for my darkest side of the lighthouse, and I'm going to use a slightly lighter tone for this one because it'll go light, medium and dark. So I want this to be not as dark as that one that we used, and I'm just going to test it on here. And you can see we've got a couple of tones lighter, and I may even try and make that run out of water as well, so I'm not going to load my brush up too much. I'll wipe it on here first on the cloth, back to my marl stick, lay it on here, leave a very small gap, and then down with a medium colour. And while that's still wet, I'm going to introduce some burnt sienna into this. It's not actually rusty, isn't this? But I want it to appear as if it is. So I'm just going to add some burnt sienna where the metalwork is underneath this banister, and I'm going to allow it to run down. So I'm going to lift my board up vertically. Sometimes it needs help. I'll just add some water to it. I don't mind if I get a cauliflower. And I may just splash. And you've got to be careful not to splash in your sky, like I've just done. And I'll encourage this to come down. Then we'll have some bigger blobs. Introduce some on this side too, and I may just splash with water as well to encourage cauliflowers. I'm just holding that as a mask and just flicking paint onto here. A combination of paint and water. If you don't like anything, don't like that big blob, just dab it with your tissue. And that looks suitably old now. And just to introduce a darker line underneath, go back to my caput mortuum. There would be shadow under here. I'm just going to get that shape back. And I'm quite happy with that. So we'll let that dry and then we'll come back and do the lightest side. Welcome back, and as you can see I've done a lot more work on the cranes now and the weather vane, and all that work's been done with a combination of either black or the yellow or caput mortuum to give us different depths. So the nearer the things are, the brighter they are and the darker they are. And the weather vane was just done with a marl stick as well. So now I'm going to put some more rust onto this mid area. And to do that I'm going to use a toothbrush, but I want to make sure that I don't flick paint in my sky. So I'm going to I'll position that there because I'm quite happy for some rust to go on this front area, and I'm going to use my hand on this side, and I'm loading the brush up with some burnt sienna, and that'll just give me more rust spots. I'll just wipe that off while I can. And if you just press them with your finger, they go even darker. Take that away, and we should have some rust spots on the light area now. And now I'm going to just take a brush that's this size, and I'm just going to use a very weak caput mortuum for the lightest side of this. It is white, but I don't want it to appear too white, so I'll use the marl stick again. Good thing about having plastic pipe is that you can just wipe it down as well. So I'm going to start on here, and I'm just going to come down here in one sweep, and I want some dry brush on there. And that's now the lightest part of there would be some shadow under here. In fact, there's a trellis walkway on here, and it's going to cast a shadow down there, so I'll do that first, and then I'll wait for that to dry, and then I'll put this trellis on down there, and then we'll make a start on these buildings here. So I'll be back in a moment. Sorry, I forgot to turn the camera on. I painted the canopy of this just with this verdigris colour. It's made of copper, and all I did was I lifted out some highlights on the left hand side, added some dark to the dark sides, a little bit more on here, and then just added some rust spots to the top of that. This is also circular down here, so I'm going to do exactly the same, but this time I'll use a flat brush. And I'll do this wetting wet. So I'm just going to wet this area vertically. Going to leave a little strip of white on the top there where the sun would be catching it. Then I'm going to paint that with the green. And I'm going to let it run to almost white on the left hand side. A little bit of lifting off on the left. Do some more up here. So I've just added a damp brush to this. Squeeze my brush out and lifting off. So you want a gradual transition from light to dark. And then I'll add a stripe of dark onto this and just let that blend. So it starts to look circular. There's a lip under here, so it would have a shadow underneath here. So this is just with dark caput mortuum. I'll strengthen the dark side, I think. Luke. And then just like I did with the other one, I'll just add a few rust spots. Again, just with a little bit of burnt umber, just randomly add some rust of varying strengths to that. And now you can see that looks circular with rust. Okay, we'll just let that dry and then I'll come back and do the maybe some work on the background. So now back to my marl stick. I'm going to do these railings, which are also green. I'm going to be very careful here. I can do the ones that are not. If I touch across the wet now, it'll bleed. So I'm just going to do a few on the outside. Let's have another one there. Maybe the one behind. And I can do some on this side. So I've already lifted the highlights out just here. So I'm just going to paint the right hand side with green. That one very straight, was it? Oh, that one. Okay, so they've been bent by the lighthouse keeper. I'm going to leave those in front there just so that they're nice and sharp when I paint them. So I'll do that when it's dry. Okay, so now this area is dry, so back on my marl stick. Hopefully I can get them a bit straighter this time. I've strengthened the paint slightly so it shows up better. I'm just moving along. A good tip when you're doing something like this is to start in the middle, and hopefully it helps with the spacing. Sometimes when I'm teaching children I say if you're trying to do a straight line, stop breathing. But I sometimes forget to tell them to start breathing again. Hopefully the spacing will work out. Not bad. And then while that's still wet, I'll just add a few little specks of rust to that. You won't have rusty things in the back and not rusty things here. So I'll just add a few random specks. If you ever want to know where to put the rust, try and imagine where the rain hits it and runs down. So under here would be a good place, and maybe under here too. And so that's the fence now. So I'll let that dry and then we'll start on another section. Okay, now with the mouth stick I'm going to put these green side rails on the windows, just leaving a white edge on the left hand side. I've just lifted these out. Down there too. That looks reasonably convincing, and then just by hand I'll just paint the back ones a little bit paler. So there would be one here, one about there. Fingers are great for just smudging things as well. Okay, so that'll do for that section. I've also added a little bit more green, as if the paints used to be that colour and it's not anymore. And I added a few darks down here as well. I'm kind of thinking that it needs a window in here. There isn't actually a window in this building, but it would give me the opportunity to put a shadow on there. So I'm thinking that I might lift one out from here, say. There is actually a little one just there. Let's say there's one here. Just working my way down with a flat brush. And then just dab that with tissue, and that's where it's going to have a window. But we'll let that dry first and then come back to you.